here about once a month, and usually they turn the air conditioning on, but because Ian's talking tonight, they thought they'd leave it off and increase the beer sales. Look, thank you very much for coming along. I just want to introduce Ian. He'll talk for 20 minutes or half an hour, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. So keep your questions to the end. Without any further ado, let me just introduce Ian. Ian's the International Environment Officer for the Government of Tuvalu. He's represented Tuvalu as part of their delegation to climate change meetings since the start of the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. So Ian's been at the coalface of the incredible success that is the world's attempts to tackle climate change. And if you've got any problems with what we've achieved, all I can say is blame Ian. He's been there. Ian spoke to us. In fact, Ian gave the inaugural Politics in the Pub. I don't know if you know that, Ian, but that was our first one in this venue, at least, and that was in February 2010 after the Copenhagen round of negotiations. So we thought it'd be great to get him back to here and talk about, after Durban, is climate change on the back burner. And just a little plug, the next Politics in the Pub will be on the 18th of April, so put it in your diary. We haven't quite locked the speaker in yet, but 18th of April will be the date. And there'll be some clipboards floating around. If we don't have your email address and you want to be kept up to date about Politics in the Pub, that's really the only way to find out who, where and when. So without any further ado, Ian Fry.
Thank you very much, Richard, and it's a pleasure to be here. I was part of the Tuvalu delegation in... is that right? Okay, yep. Sorry. So I was part of the Tuvalu delegation. We had the Minister for Foreign Affairs there, Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Head of the Environment Department. So it was quite a big delegation, high-level delegation for us. So what happened in Durban? I'm going to talk about sort of what happened in Durban and what are the sort of consequences of it, and is climate change on the back burner as the sort of theme of the discussion. So what came out of Durban was two key elements of issues. One which was called the Durban Platform, which is I think well named, because I think it's a sort of, it indicates that the train is called into the station and has lost steam. It really just is not going very far. And the other aspect of it was the Kyoto Protocol, and there was an agreement in Durban to continue the Kyoto Protocol. But we agreed to continue it, but we really didn't set any time frame or targets. And the Australian government is, is one of the culprits in this, that they never put any numbers on the table in the part of the negotiation process. A lot of the other countries actually put numbers on the table as for the next commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, but Australia didn't do it. So what did Durban say? In the last hours, in the last sessions of Durban went for 36 hours straight, basically. We went over the Friday for another 36 hours, which was an extraordinary sort of negotiation process. And what the final words were, we would agree, finalise a protocol, a legal instrument, or an agreed outcome with legal force. So that was the compromise that was reached at the last minute. And we, as small island states, were pushing very hard to get agreement to get a new protocol off the ground. That was the sort of key aim of our work. And so this sort of compromise language is really inadequate. What is an outcome with legal force? Does it just mean that countries will agree to some sort of action and they'll put it in force within their own countries? It's not necessarily meaning there'll be an international legal outcome. So that's pretty disappointing in that process. If you look at it from sort of a half full, half empty sort of outcome, the Executive Secretary of the Climate Convention said just this week at a conference in the United Kingdom, she said it was a good outcome. Basically, she says we now have on board all the major emitters globally onto some sort of track to agree to reduce their emissions. She also said that the world has now invested $1 trillion on renewable energy. And I think that's certainly progress. But clearly this sort of getting everybody on board is not really on board to what? And this is the disappointing aspect of it, is that we agreed that we'd have some sort of legal outcome by 2015 and that it would come into force in 2020. That's a long way off as far as climate change is concerned. And we just heard the report of the state of climate change put out by CSI today, saying that the average temperature today is 0.9 degrees above what it was in 1910. So this is scientific evidence saying that we're really experiencing climate change here in Australia. So this is a crucial issue, and yet we're not going to have further legally binding outcomes till 2020. So why is this the case? And clearly within the negotiation process that we had there, I rest a lot of blame on the United States. We went into that meeting and to start off with, and the United States basically said, we got everything we wanted in Cancun, which was that was the last climate change meeting 12 months ago, and Cancun was really a rehash of the Copenhagen Accord, which was basically countries pledging and reviewing. So basically putting down numbers saying we're going to do something and without any sort of legally binding outcome. And that was and if you look closely at those sort of pledges that were made originally in the Copenhagen Accord, then again in the Cancun Agreement, there's some pretty rubbery numbers that have been presented. The United States says that it was going to reduce its emissions by 17% of its 2005 level by 2020. But what does that really mean? What is 17% reduction in 2005? I mean, most countries have used 1990 as the base year. That's what the Kyoto Protocol says. The US says, no, we'll make it 2005. Why is that? Because its emissions were a lot higher than 2005 than it was in 1990. So it's a problem. And of course, the problem is that there's no knowing what their emissions were in 2005. They haven't released the sort of base year figures of what they're saying. So this creates a problem for us. China has put forward as part of their pledge that they're going to reduce their intensity of emissions by 45% by 2020. And this is a problem because if you have a relative to intensity, which is a sort of measure of GDP, if their GDP grows, then they're, you're giving a great allowance for emissions as well. Brazil said they were going to reduce their emissions below business as usual by 36%. But just in recent times, they've readjusted their business as usual upwards of 18%. So you're getting these really rubbery figures sort of floating around. So it's really hard. And I think it's difficult to be involved in a negotiation when the United States says from the outset, we got what we wanted in Cancun. We don't need anything new till 2020. So how do you negotiate, more substantial legal outcomes to get all countries on board when you've got a major player, the biggest polluter of the world in a per capita basis? Now China has slightly got more emissions than the United States, and it's very hard. And I think you have to sort of look at it in the context also of how that was reported here in Australia. And if you look at the reports that came out about the sort of outcomes in Durban, you see China and India being blamed because in the last few days there was a lot of pressure on China and India to accept a sort of some language about a legally binding outcome. But in reality, it was the United States right from the beginning who were blocking this. And I was listening to The World Today yesterday, and Professor Ian Shapiro, who's just out from the USA, was saying that what we're seeing is this growth in inequity in the United States, where the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And this has happened since the 1970s. And I think what you're seeing as a result is this sort of general loss of democracy. And what we're seeing is the power of corporations being so much stronger in the United States. And if you look at just the numbers of the figures that are being used in the current election process to elect a Republican, Mitt Romney has already spent $200 million on his election campaign. $200 million on his election campaign. That's extraordinary. 45 million of that from his own pocket. You know, this is a rich man's business, and it's extraordinary. The 2008 presidential election for the major candidates cost $5 billion. Half of that going to advertising. So you can see even Obama, you know, needs to get that money from somewhere. And clearly those people who are giving that money for those election campaigns are dominating the policy. And this is where we're at the moment, and this is the problem. And there was a court case in the United States that was the Citizens United Supreme Court Act which threw away any limits on restrictions on corporate donors and so forth. And so it's really hard to have a major country where they're beholden to these huge donors. And this is a salutary note for us as well. I mean, clearly our elections in Australia are heading that way. We're becoming more presidential in our election processes. More money is spent in elections, and we have to think about whether this is the right way forward. I mean, that's looking at things pretty grimly, I guess, but there are some positive trends. Certainly, just in the last week or so, the California launched its emissions trading scheme. It introduced legislation late last year, and now it has it up and running. So this is an emissions trading scheme in the state of California. It's the 8th largest economy in the world. So that's a substantial move forward. They introduced legislation which allows for 33% of all electricity to be produced by renewable energy sources by 2020. So there are some positive outcomes. President Obama recently blocked the Keystone XL gas line, the pipeline which was to send crude oil from Alberta, from the oil sands, one of the most polluting forms of fossil fuels that you can find, from Canada down to Texas, where it was going to be reprocessed. And Obama has recently blocked that and has faced challenge in the Congress. They introduced new legislation to stop that blockage, and Obama has come back again and said it. And ironically, Hillary Clinton says, we've blocked this pipeline because it undermines the United States' clean energy future and its international leadership on climate change. A certain sort of irony in that sort of statement. I guess, you know, there are other sort of outcomes that have happened since Durban. Canada has withdrawn from the Kyoto Protocol. It's basically walked away from it. It made statements earlier on that it was not going to be party to the second commitment period. Same with Russia and Japan. But it's actually given notice that it's withdrawing from the Kyoto Protocol. And at the time I was interviewed by Reuters, and I said this was a reckless act, that is an act of sabotage against the future of Tuvalu. Why is Canada so important? There's a lot of symbolism and importance in the Kyoto Protocol, in that it has an architecture that brings about reductions in emissions. It has a compliance system, it has a trading system, it has a system that allows individuals to go into countries and assess whether they're actually reducing their emissions. These are called expert review teams. If we don't have that system, we just have this, what the US wants is a sort of pledge and review. You throw up a target and then you just hope that you meet that target without any sort of compliance, without any sort of penalty. So the architecture of the Kyoto Protocol is very important. We've got problems with Japan and Russia, again, sort of saying they're not going to be part of the second commitment period. But there's some positive signs. A major Japanese company has just called SoftBank Corp has invested 12.3 million into renewable energy. So they see that there's a future in it. But, you know, probably the most progressive group of countries, the European Union, are also struggling at the moment. They're struggling with a low value of carbon in their emissions trading scheme. It went down to 3.2 euros per tonne, which is certainly well below what they think is a reasonable number for an emissions trading scheme. And they're certainly battling with some of the Eastern European countries, particularly Poland, who are rejecting a new target setting approach. So, you know, globally we're really sort of struggling to deal with these issues. So I guess you know, it's not looking fantastic. There was a report just put out by the UN Conference on Trade and Development, basically just in a recent week or so, saying that the carbon intensity that we currently use in energy is 130 times more than what we need to get to a 2 degrees Celsius stabilisation level. So our use of energy is 130 times what we need to get us to a 2 degrees Celsius. And we fought very hard against the number 2 degrees Celsius. In Copenhagen, you know, Tuvalu rejected the Copenhagen Accord because it made a reference to 2 degrees. Because the science tells us that a 2 degrees Celsius stabilisation level will mean Tuvalu will disappear. That will raise the sea levels to a length that Tuvalu will disappear. Earlier this month, in March, there was a sort of what was called a Future Actions meeting, which is the sort of major countries who are dealing with climate change negotiations met, and the conclusions of that meeting, again, are not terribly inspiring. They agreed that the Global Climate Fund would be established, that they've established an adaptation committee, which is quite good, but they're saying that this year will be a brainstorming year, which seems to be a sort of you know, a time for inaction. So these are some of the dilemmas we're facing in the sort of climate change front at the moment. And what can be done to deal with this? Has the UN failed in this sort of process? I am an unabashed internationalist in this area, and I think it's important that the UN continue in this sort of process. We need to bring countries together to deal with this issue. It can't be just done by individuals or individual countries alone. But there are clearly some things that we need to do. We have to find ways of isolating the US. There's no way we can make real progress unless we deal with that. So there needs to be trade pacts between countries to promote renewable energy. You know, that may leave the United States out of the picture. We need to place trade restrictions on goods that have use embedded emissions, you know, heavily embedded emissions. We've got to certainly deal more successfully with deforestation issues. This is a crucial aspect of the current debate. We made a small bit of progress, but there's a lot of problems, you know, with you know, carbon cowboys seeing this whole deforestation issue as a new way of making money. And there are Australian companies trying to cash in on this whole deforestation debate. There's recently reported an Australian working in Peru, you know, has started issuing carbon credits, you know, and on land that is owned by Indigenous peoples. Another company, you know, offering carbon credits in Papua New Guinea. So we have to deal with this sort of corruption issues that are associated with this whole new carbon bonanza with deforestation and deal with the issues. The real problem with the discussion on deforestation is that we're not dealing with the real drivers of deforestation. You know, if you look at the demand for tropical timber coming out of China at the moment, there's this huge sucking sound. You know, they're drawing on the world's resources. They have companies operating in all major tropical forested areas in the world, and they're putting in infrastructure there. So even if we you know, help, you know, do projects in Vietnam or Papua New Guinea or whatever, you know, we might just see the forest of Laos disappear that much quicker because we haven't dealt with the demand, and we're failing to deal with that sort of demand side issues in the climate change debate. So these are some of the sort of institutional issues that we have with us. I just thought I'd sort of finish my discussion with a few anecdotes of the climate process, because it's you know, it's a crazy business being involved in negotiations. I was involved with the least developed countries, because Tuvalu is the least developed country, and I was involved in the ministerial discussions of that, giving help to the minister from Gambia on the climate change. So you get into these sort of small rooms, you know, where the real negotiations take place. So I sort of typified a few characters. Firstly, you've got the sort of po-faced American. Todd Stern was there representing the White House and basically saying, no, we don't need to do anything more. And that's really hard to negotiate with somebody who's in that situation. Then we had the belligerent Europeans, and I refer particularly to the European Environment Commissioner, Connie Hedegaard, if you remember, from Copenhagen. She was leading that meeting. We had a bilateral meeting between the least developed countries and Connie Hedegaard and the UK Environment Minister, and she was thumping the table and saying, we've got to get to China. We've got to get to China. If we get China on board, we'll have an agreement in this meeting. So these are sort of, well, you know, maybe we're forgetting somebody else in this picture, you know, but they were really keen to do about that. 3 a.m. in the morning on the last night of Durban, I had just been involved with sort of ministerial roundtables and just came out for a break, and I saw the Mexican delegation heading off towards the sort of, you know, the area where the Secretariat is. And I grabbed the ambassador, Ambassador De Alva, and I said, what's happening here, Ambassador? And he said, oh, we're going to help the South Africans fix this. And I thought to myself, this doesn't look too good. Knowing what happened in Cancun and how they fixed the outcome in Cancun, I wasn't too pleased with this. So the next morning, I got called to a little room in the dungeons of this conference centre. It was actually the car park. They refurbished the car park and put in sort of prefab rooms, and they had sort of key negotiators there. There were 20 people there. And this paper was produced, which is what the Mexicans thought they had an agreement between the US, EU and China, and they had it written on the top of this. You know, this is the countries that agreed on this outcome, which was basically the language of what the legal form was. The EU saw this and went ballistic, you know, and they stormed out of the room, and it was, you know, so these sort of little fixes that sometimes happen in this process are not really what they are at all. The other thing about that little room session was China was sitting there, the key negotiator for China, and says, we're not going to discuss any discussion about whether we have a new legally binding agreement until we hear from the chair of the negotiation.